Hello and welcome to Alfie the Lobster channel.
Hello and welcome back to Alfie the Lobster. I hope you enjoyed our last video. I know it was about music and not architecture, but this channel talks about things in terms of design and design content, so I hope you enjoyed the music video. Today, I want to talk to you about tanks. And what do tanks have to do with buildings? Well, the logic behind a tank, it should be the same sort of logic that goes behind a building. And if you look at the building, even though if the building looks kind of illogical, if you know the design process, you can sort of figure out why somebody's done something. And usually the best design has that, including graphic design and also the design of light bulbs and also the design of air conditioners. Although I must admit air conditioners aren't exactly aesthetic. But when it comes to architecture, there should be a deep design process that makes something look real. So let's talk about the Crystal Palace exhibition real quick, which I talked about in my video on modernism. As I had mentioned in that, glass, metal, and mass production were all coming into play because of science. And so what happened is that this started to change design, because rather than having local materials and local craftsmen and also local culture causing the forms of the architecture in the regions, that was now replaced. And so the styles don't look the same anymore because of the access to these new materials. So architects are now running around trying to figure out what to do to replace the old cultural icons. And they've come up with many different solutions, some of them based in fact and some of them just based in sort of personal taste. The old ways of craft and materials like brick, mortar, and craftsmen go away and are replaced by things like concrete structures, metal structures, and of course, as I said, mass production. The steel in buildings and plasticity of concrete allow pretty much the shape of any building. Although I must admit sometimes the buildings can become highly repetitive because they are mass produced to decrease cost. That can be rather boring. And sometimes because they're stripped of any kind of cultural ornament and only the architecture's notion of the aesthetic beauty kind of leaves people cold. Although sometimes the architect tries maybe a little too hard and we get some really goofy solutions that probably are just personal aesthetic. Most architecture that's really deep has something that's more than just personal aesthetic. There are different ways of putting things together, and usually that comes from the logic of the problem. So we're eventually going to get back to architecture, but let's look at the way things are mass produced. Like things like a plane. This obviously looks like it's an almost organic thing. It's like a bird. You can tell it it's meant for speed. It's meant to fly. The form itself is almost, again, an organic form, and that's the reason why it works. When you're trying to make a car that goes fast, the form has to take on a certain general shape and a certain general size, and you can see that there's a certain level of truth in what the design is all about. Sometimes architects can get away with designing because they have their own personal aesthetic. This is the Firehouse, the Vitra Firehouse by Zaha Hadid, and she happened to have a really good personal taste, and you can see that in her paintings, which is what she used as the basis of her design. Very personal, but really good design tends to transcend the personal, and I'd like to take a look at tank design and how it evolved in an organic fashion and how the solution was more than just a personal interpretation. Let's look at the conditions that caused the need for the tank and its evolution. That, of course, was the First World War, which is a modern machine war. Mass-produced guns, mass-produced bullets in a no-man's land with mass-produced wire that trapped the troops. And if they weren't caught up in the wire, they were caught up in the artillery shells, of course, again, mass-produced, that created this muddy muck. And the reason for the no-man's land, in the first place, and the trenches, the machine gun, because men would just be mowed down with ease by small machine gun crews. And so trench warfare became the norm, and a solution was required. Winston Churchill called for what he said was a land battleship. Well, in order to have a land battleship, you have to have certain combinations of technology. A guy named Holt invented the tractor, realizing that it was so heavy it would sink into the ground. The caterpillar tracks were added to spread the pressure and the weight over such a large area that the caterpillar tracks basically made the tractor float on the soil. So this is the first part of the problem that was solution to the problem. And Little Willie was the first attempt at a land battleship for Mr. Churchill. So the British were the first to start inventing the tank. Little Willie's basically no more than a tractor with a little bit of armor and some holes punched in it so you could shoot out. It was a top secret project, and when asked why what this thing was, the designer said it's just a tank to carry water in the desert, and so the name tank stuck. Little Willie, being the first venture, eventually evolved into the Mark I and then into the Mark V, but we'll get into that. So how do you solve this problem of a deep trench with men hidden from view? What's the solution? Well, tank is a component of 3 different variables, one of which is armor, one of which is firepower, and one of which is mobility. The Mark V shown here, the British tank, the solution was pretty straightforward. The tank was long enough that it could span a trench, and when it did span the trench, the sponsons on either side were able to shoot down and kill the enemy in the depths. But they didn't have the speed that was necessary to exploit the breakthrough. They didn't have any shock absorbing systems, so the people would get seasick on the inside, and the troops that were following them, if they were up on the top, and if they didn't get seasick from the lack of suspension, they also got sick from the fact that they were in the same compartment in the engine and they took in fumes. Again, you can see the shape is perfect for spanning a trench and shooting down into a trench. The armor wasn't light enough, no suspension, not a great deal of firepower, definitely no mobility, and at first, the Germans are like, what the heck is this thing? And so they need a response. They don't do much better. Again, no suspension, very light armor, holes poked in it for guns to be fired out of it. Not a really good solution to the tank problem, but certainly the start. The British wound up having another tank that came from the Allies, which was the Whippet tank. This did have the one component of the 3 prongs that's necessary for a good tank, and it had speed. Unfortunately, they put the crew compartment at the back, so visibility was bad. It was also lightly armored, so the crew wasn't really protected. And you had just little machine guns poking out, so no armor, no firepower. And certainly the person on the inside operating the machine guns had to run around the turret while the other drove the tank forward. Very, very poor design in that respect. The French come up with a solution that deals with the problem of firepower. One man in a turret can use a large gun to protect the entire tank, although he'll have the problem of having to load the gun, aim the gun, shoot the gun, and tell the driver where to go, so he's a bit overloaded, but the turret really makes firepower viable. Also, the French take the engine, separate it from the crew compartment, and put it in the back, so now there's no choking fumes in the crew compartment. But the problem also extends to how the heck do you use a tank? In military terms, it's called doctrine. If you really don't know how to use a weapon, it can't be employed properly, and it doesn't matter how good it is. Anyway, at the beginning of the war, the Battle of the Somme, they started using the Mark V's, but they didn't use them en masse, and they didn't use them with a secret fast attack. So the enemy was aware that they were coming. They could be targeted, and also a lot of the ones that didn't break down could be targeted, and because they didn't come en masse, even if they could make a breakthrough, they wouldn't be able to exploit it. Later in the war, at the Battle of Cambrai, the tanks were used successfully because they were used en masse. They were now mechanically a little bit more reliable, and they were used in secrecy, so the enemy didn't have time to prepare. This would be the beginnings of the proper doctrine for tanks, but not the completion of the process. So the war, fortunately, ends, and after that, a consideration of doctrine has to be done, and the theoreticians, Little Hart and Fuller, get together and recognize that speed, mobility, and firepower are necessary in the tank, and in order to exploit that, you have to have good battle tactics, of which you want to be able to make breakthroughs with the main battle tank and then have lighter tanks to go through and take advantage. This is the beginning of what later becomes known as the Blitzkrieg, but they started, and of course you have a German officer named Guderian who writes the book on it. He literally does a full research of the tank's use in the First World War, presents it to Hitler, and starts developing in secret, because by the Treaty of Versailles they're not allowed to have tanks. They start to develop in secret tank corps. So in comes the designer who's able to focus all the information, take that, and analyze it, and make a real tank. That's J. Walter Christie. He was a crazy guy that didn't get along well with people, but he was smart as heck and an inventor. He also raced cars. Here you can see a transversely mounted front-wheel drive car, which was so ahead of its time it wouldn't be picked up until the 1950s by Fiat, and then eventually became the standard for all internal combustion engine cars that we have today. Most of them are front-wheel drive. Christie, being a great designer, looks at all the problems and variables with tank, is able to come up with a solution that's still used by most main battle tanks today. Here you can see his innovative suspension, which allows the crew to travel fast, so we have mobility, and also they don't wind up getting seasick, so they're able to get to the battle. It's fairly fresh. He keeps the FT-17 by Renault's engine in the back configuration in the turret, although early on he's still using machine guns rather than a up gun. But eventually winds up with an up gun so that we have the firepower. It's also mobile enough that you could take the tracks off and still drive it without using the tracks, so you could get to the battlefield quickly at 70 miles per hour, which is quite impressive for the tanks of its day, and 40 miles per hour off-road. So there's one final variable here, and that's of course armor. If you have too much armor, the vehicle's too heavy, and so therefore you lose your mobility. If you have too big a gun, the same. So you have to have a balance. He comes up with a sloped armor system, which basically, because it's sloped, it allows the bullets to deflect, and also the apparent amount of armor to the incoming bullet is actually thicker because of the slope. And he's got it all together. I mean, this particular version, the turret's not upgunned enough, but the American Army just decides we don't like it because we don't really like him. We're going to build it and design our own in-house and say to heck with you. And Christie's left with some prototype tanks, and nobody purchased them. So in come the Russians. Purchased 4 of Christie's tanks, and basically, as you can see here, have taken the Christie's entire system and made it into the V.2, which becomes the first venture by the Russians to do a mass-produced tank. They've honed some things down. The wheels are slightly different, and some of the shapes different for mass production. But that's that's the beginning of the modern battle tank as it is. The Germans, seeing this, decide to copy it because they've been working in secret with the Russians and start building tanks using the basic Christie concept. This here is a Mark II Panzer, which was used in the war, the Lightning War in France, and allowed them to attack the French so quickly that the war in that area was over in weeks. They eventually took that design and modified it so they could up-armor it, make it faster, and gave it a larger gun. And this became the tank that really was winning the war up until the point that Hitler decided to invade Russia, and he came across one of these. This is a T-34-85. The original was a T-34-75, the 75 meaning a 75 millimeter gun. You can see the sloped armor has just been perfected. The Christie suspension is still being used, and a larger, much larger gun in the turret with more people in the turret has been added. So you're now able to have a tank commander who can be more focused on finding targets and giving the instructions to the driver. You have a driver who's isolated in the front, a bow gunner machine gun, so that you can also get rid of troops locally. And because you have that extra space in the turret now, because it's a larger tank, you're able to have a crewman who can load and also fire the gun. So really, that's the basis of what a main battle tank is, and it still holds today, even in tanks like our M1 Abrams battle tank. We've looked at the design of this tank and seen that a whole bunch of variables have to be considered in order to come up with a great design solution. And the reason why I did this is because I want to bring it back to architecture in my next video, which is going to feature a guy named Le Corbusier, who's considered one of the greatest architects of the last century. Corbusier has a long evolution of his design process, which I'll cover, and you can see how he evolves over time. He starts off doing rather traditional buildings, and then he winds up doing the modern style that he evolves, which has mass production, machining, metals, modern materials, sort of an interesting plan, but also very regular and mathematical. But through the development of this process, he winds up with something that appears to be rather arbitrary and meaningless in terms of logic, and yet he does have an underlying logic that explains this, and it is the culmination of all of his years of effort. So although it looks like it's sort of a sculptural, maybe arbitrary thing, it has a lot of feeling and depth to it, and we'll get into that later on in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this one, and glad you came back to the cave with Alfie and I. We look forward to working with you, but in order for our channel to keep on growing, we need you to do the hard work, which is hitting the little button that says like for this video, if you did like it. Subscribe to my channel so that I can get monetized eventually, and share it with your friends so that I can get more likes and subscribes. If you can do that for me, Alfie would be very happy, and it'll help him escape the hot butter and it'll help him escape the hot butter treatment and stay alive for another episode or two. Thanks for joining us. Peace out.
Breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law.